In the real world, every object casts a shadow. How exactly the shadow looks depends on a number of factors. First of all, the lighting conditions. It is therefore not surprising that in CSS we also have the option of adding a shadow effect to our elements and even making a whole lot of different settings for the shadow. To be able to see this, I have again prepared a simple sample document. It only consists of a large h1 heading and a div tag with 2 paragraphs in the form of p tags. In addition, a style.css file is already included. This CSS file currently only contains some information about the div tag. Its width is limited to half the width of our page. In addition, the entire div is moved to the horizontal center using the margin auto and is given a frame with rounded corners with the border properties. To get some space between the text and the border, a bit of padding is set in the end. That's why it currently looks like this in the browser. Here we can see the large heading, and below that the 2 paragraphs with their frame. There is no shadow at all here. Let's change that now. To add a shadow to our text, we can use the text shadow property. If we want to give our heading a shadow, we can create an entry for h1 elements in our CSS file and write text shadow for the property name. We can now enter 2 numbers as value in a unit supported by CSS, for example 3 pixels and 5 pixels. The first number indicates how far the shadow should be shifted to the right, and the second value indicates the offset downwards. In order to move the shadow to the left or upwards, negative values can simply be entered here. Now we can save the file and return to the browser. If we now refresh the page, we immediately see what our code is doing, because our heading now appears a second time, just a little to the right and below the actual heading. It is also immediately noticeable that this does not really look like a shadow, especially because the shadow, like the heading, is completely black. This is because the shadow tags on the color of the text by default, so if we add a color property with blue as value to our entry to color the heading blue, save the file and return to the browser, we see that the shadow now also has turned blue. Fortunately, it is very easy to adjust the color of the shadow, because all we have to do is write the desired color into the value for the text shadow assignment. We can position it either at the very beginning or at the end of the assignment. As long as the color is not between the values for the offset, it will work. For example, let's add light blue for the color to the value, save and return to the browser. Now we just have to refresh the page and we can see that the shadow now appears in a much lighter blue than before. Unfortunately, it still doesn't really look like a shadow. It is much too sharp for that, so it currently just looks like a copy of the text in a different color. If we want to add blurring to the shadow, we can add a third number in our value. This value specifies the length over which the shadow should change from completely opaque to completely transparent. The higher this value is, the more blurred the shadow will be. For example, if we specify 5 pixels here, save and return to the browser, the shadow is already very blurred and the text it represents can hardly be recognized anymore. If, on the other hand, we reduce the value to 2 pixels for example, and refresh the page in the browser again, we get a shadow that is rather blurred but clearly more recognizable than before. But the fun doesn't stop there, because CSS also allows us to define multiple shadows for the same text. We do this by simply separating the individual shadow definitions with commas. The first defined shadow is always on top, and each additional shadow is placed one level further back. In this way, for example, let's add a second shadow for our heading and therefore put a comma after the values for the first shadow. This second shadow can, for example, be located a bit higher and to the left of the actual text. So let's first specify -5 pixels and -2 pixels for the offset, in order to move the shadow from the original text 5 pixels to the left and 2 pixels up. In addition, it gets a relatively high degree of blurring, for example 5 pixels, and we specify purple for the color. We can now save that, return to the browser and refresh the page, and our second shadow will already be visible. We could now add as many more shadows as we want in the same way. The principle is always the same. As the name suggests, we can only use the text shadow property to add shadows to texts. If we want to put a shadow on our div with the paragraphs, we have to use another property, and this property is called box shadow. This allows us to define shadows that are cast from the edge of the element. The box shadow works almost exactly like the shadow for text. Here too, we can define several shadows in one assignment, and each shadow basically consists of values for the horizontal and vertical offset, the blurring, and the color. So let's try this out by adding a box shadow assignment to our entry for the div tag. For example, for the offset, we could specify 5 pixels in each direction to cast the shadow down to the right. We specify 3 pixels for the blurring, so that the shadow is not too blurry. For the color of the shadow, I would like a simple gray best. We are therefore specifying an RGB function here and defining 100 for each of the color channels. Now we just have to end the assignment with a semicolon, save and refresh the page in the browser, and we see the shadow of our div. We can also see that the shadow has actually taken on the shape of the edge of our element and therefore also has rounded corners. Unlike the text shadow property, the box shadow property allows us to adjust the actual size of the shadow. For this purpose, a fourth numerical value is specified in a unit supported by CSS. 0 stands for the original size of the element, so if we want to enlarge the shadow, we can specify a number that is greater than 0, which is then added to the size of the element. And to reduce the size of the shadow, we specify a negative number that is then subtracted from the size of the element. Let's just enter 5px here to enlarge the shadow by 5 pixels, save and return to the browser. Now we can refresh the page and admire our new large shadow. So far, however, this shadow has always been a drop shadow. It therefore looks like the element is floating over the rest of the page. We can reverse this effect by adding the inset keyword as the first value to our assignment. This has the effect that the shadow is not cast from the element, but into the element, which makes it appear as if the contents were lowered to the back. That also looks really interesting in the browser. So we can see that we have many options in CSS to give our texts and elements shadows and to design them as we need them. In addition to the classic drop shadows, these properties are also used in practice for all sorts of other things, for example for hover or light effects. We will cover how this works in future projects and videos, so subscribe to the channel and be back next time.